must all hang together, or, most assuredly, we shall all hang separately. You say you want a revolution. Well, you know, even if we don't all want to change the world, history is full of revolutions that have done just that. Industrial revolutions, cultural revolutions, sexual revolutions. But there's nothing quite so much fun as a political revolution. So, let's find our cause, turn the world upside down, tear down the old order, and replace them with us. What could possibly go wrong? There's an awful lot of history in the world. Too much, really. So, let's skip all the boring stuff and get straight to the interesting bits. Sit back while we bring you the surprising, funny, frightening, and sometimes downright odd true stories about what people in the past were getting up to, and how to make it all work for you. This is History. The interesting bits. Revolutions are serious. You need a really good reason to start stockpiling weapons, piling furniture in the streets, and mounting the barricades. After all, it could well be your furniture, so you don't want to rush things.
Almost all revolutions fail. States do not like to be overthrown, and they tend to respond violently when you try. So you better be willing to risk your life if you're going to make this effort, and it often takes an extraordinarily charismatic leader to persuade people to do that.
A successful revolution needs a leader with transformative ideas and organizational skill. So, how do you match up to, say, Vladimir Lenin? In early 1917, the Russian Revolution was in full swing. But Lenin wasn't enjoying it at all. He was in exile in Switzerland, eating chocolate and editing a political pamphlet. Pamphlets were one of the ways to incite like-minded revolutionaries in the days before social media. But slower and with fewer cat videos. But how do you incite the crowds to take to the streets? The answer can be surprising. In 1830, in Brussels, it was a rousing opera that so inflamed those in attendance they streamed from the theatre and started attacking the homes of prominent politicians. Let's face it, opera has made most of us feel like that at times. But 2 months later, the Belgians had overthrown their Dutch rulers and become an independent nation. Poor old Lenin, however, was in real danger of being left behind. The February Revolution of 1917 was in full swing without him, and a provisional government had forced the Tsar to abdicate. Lenin knew the time for pamphlets was over. There was a Tsar-shaped hole in the Russian government, and he intended to fill it.
He saw that actually the revolution was being driven forward by the people on the ground, the little activists whose names we don't know. And they needed someone to actually empower them to keep on pushing the revolution forward. And what they needed was a shepherd.
And Lenin believed that he was that shepherd. As a Bolshevik, he was part of a movement that planned to sweep aside the old order and install a dictatorship of the proletariat. The provisional government didn't impress him, but he saw what they'd started as an opportunity to further his aims. And even when revolution is in the air, you still have to be careful not to jump the gun, as would-be rebel John the Painter found in 1775. John wasn't called John. Actually, he was called James, and he was mostly a directionless criminal. But during a brief time spent in the American colonies, this rebel without a cause found one. John returned to England deeply committed, fully radicalized by the seditious talk of independence he had heard, and determined to do his bit for the struggle. So, as the American Revolutionary War kicked off across the Atlantic, John embarked on a one-man campaign of arson and sabotage aimed at crippling the Royal Navy. After a massive manhunt, the law finally ran John to ground. And while awaiting trial, he made the fatal mistake of confessing his guilt to a government informer. 20,000 people gathered to watch John the Painter swing from the highest gallows ever seen in England. And the American Revolution had to carry on without him. In 1917, the revolutionary action was in Russia, but Lenin was 2,000 miles away, so he wasn't best placed to make sure his Bolsheviks would come out on top. But there was an opportunity. The new Russian government had decided to continue the war with Germany, and it wasn't going well.
They were coming off the back of a long series of devastating losses and embarrassing losses as well, and unfulfilled promises to turn around the course of the war.
Lenin's challenge was to persuade Russia's enemy, Germany, who were not overly fond of his brand of politics themselves, to allow him to cross their territory on his way home, without arresting and executing him. So Lenin made the Germans an offer they couldn't refuse. If they let him travel home and he took power, he'd pull Russia out of the war, allowing Germany to redeploy 1 million troops from the eastern to the western front. The stage was set for Lenin to put himself at the heart of the Russian Revolution and achieve the Bolshevik dream. But not every revolution is powered by ideology.
Every revolution has its own set of motivations. It is often about a sense of injustice. Sometimes it can be a desire for independence for an ethnic group that wishes its own state. Revolutions are often triggered by populations that feel that their status is being disrespected or degraded.
And there are many ways in which people can be made to feel oppressed enough to think about rebellion. For the Sons of Liberty in Boston in 1773, it was all about tea and taxes. But for the French in 1789, cake became an issue. Well, the allegation was that French Queen Marie Antoinette, on hearing the poor had no bread, suggested they should eat brioche instead, which she almost certainly never did. But it was a great bit of propaganda for the opposition. And "let them eat cake" is the damning slogan forever associated with her name. All revolutions need a nice, memorable slogan. So you'll need one too.
The slogan is your prime tool of recruitment. It's the way to catch the attention of people who wouldn't normally side with your more in-depth party platform. It's the hook, if you will.
When it comes to creating your revolutionary slogan, nothing is off the table. From food security,
Lenin's peace, land, bread. Who's going to disagree with that one?
to abstinence.
There's the famous temperance slogan that, lips that touch liquor shall never touch mine. So that you can see a lot of playfulness in slogans.
And if this sounds more like a tea party than a proper revolution, then you should cut to the chase and make sure everyone knows that yours is a cause worth dying for.
Death in a slogan can be a sort of demonstration of sincerity and a rallying cry to actually fight with all of the life that you have within you. And we see this, of course, in the American Revolutionary War with the slogan, "Give me liberty or give me death."
It's certainly more memorable than Lenin's zinger, "Communism is Soviet power plus electrification." But if Lenin wasn't always a great sloganeer, he was a great persuader. Determined not to sit out his country's hour of turmoil in the land of cuckoo clocks, Lenin packed up his revolutionary ideals and persuaded the Kaiser to allow him to cross German territory back to Russia by sealed train. Sealed to stop German citizens catching any nasty revolutionary ideas off the passing Bolsheviks. So, you're on your way. You have a unifying cause, a slogan or two, and a leader has emerged to see it through. Now, can you avoid a bloodbath?
All the people of Cuba had now taken their places under the banner of the revolution.
Is it time to man the barricades? Well, let's not rush things. Ideally, you want to press towards a brave new world without resorting to palace storming, mass execution, and lasting recrimination.
Don't worry about it. You'll get over it all right.
The Russian Revolution had started off peacefully enough.
We see hundreds and then thousands of strikes beginning to take place.
While Imperial Russia struggled in the war against Germany, the poor on the home front had starved. By February the 23rd, 1917, the hangry women of Petrograd had had enough.
So protests begin to gain even more focus. Then on International Women's Day, the women strikers expand the strikes once again. The military then is called out to fire upon the protesters and refuses to fire. And within 48 hours of that initial refusal, we have the Tsar abdicating.
After over 300 years, the Romanov dynasty's rule was over. Bloodbath averted, so far. And you don't necessarily need to kill anyone. Some revolutionary leaders oppose violence on principle. Step forward Mohandas Gandhi and his revolution through non-violent non-cooperation. Satyagraha, truth force. In South Africa, Gandhi, an educated middle-class lawyer, experienced prejudice firsthand.
He was thrown off a train because he was not part of the white class that was allowed on the train, and he felt profoundly humiliated by this. The sense of humiliation is one of the most powerful of all human motivations. And when you read revolutionaries, they often speak about how they were motivated by the sense that they were being humiliated.
Returning to India in 1915, Gandhi began a wholly new form of revolution, peacefully protesting all forms of discrimination and campaigning for an end to British colonial rule. All of which hugely annoyed the British, but earned him the Indian title Mahatma, Great Soul. He led non-violent opposition to imprisonment without trial and pushed for the boycott of goods, including salt. The British state had a monopoly on Indian salt, and every consumer, even the poorest, had to pay tax on it. If that seems like one step away from taxing oxygen, that's because it is. So, in 1930, Gandhi walked hundreds of miles to the coast of the Arabian Sea to collect his own salt for free. Thousands more Indians joined him along the way, and eventually 60,000 of them joined him in jail. The British caved over the monopoly on salt, but Gandhi moved on to other issues to unite people behind his demands for home rule. The great soul never broke his commitment to revolution through passive resistance, and 17 years after his great walk to the sea, the British were gone.
If you wrote a novel about Mahatma Gandhi and he had never existed, there is no reputable publisher in the world who would publish it, because the story is so obviously implausible. Gandhi's motivations for peaceful revolution were profoundly wrapped up in his particular religious and ideological beliefs, but they were also wrapped up in the fact that the people he was opposing was the British Empire. Had he attempted the same peaceful tactics against, say, the Belgians or the Germans, or probably even the French, the outcome would have been radically different.
Context is everything. Uprisings against communist rule in the 1950s and 60s just brought tanks onto the streets of European capitals. But in the late 1980s, with the Soviet Union's power starting to look very shaky, many European populations took their opportunity to rebel against their puppet communist rulers. This time, the protesters chose the path of peaceful protest and had a secret weapon, the Hoff.
I've been looking for freedom, I've been looking so long.
Not quite the Mahatma, but for those demanding the fall of the Berlin Wall, an icon.
David Hasselhoff and his song is a kind of rallying call in East Germany and provides a lot of inspiration for people who are massing around that Berlin Wall and calling for it to come down. The collapse of communism in Europe was actually largely a non-violent series of revolutions, and there we get a real diversity of models of what a non-violent revolution can look like and how you can bring one about. East Germany started out as a prayer vigil that spilled out of the church and eventually grew to 500,000 people. In the Baltic republics in the Soviet Union, we get the singing revolution, where people are gathering together to sing folk songs and patriotic hymns. And this grows to the point where, in the summer of 1989, they create a human chain that links the capitals of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia with over 2 million people.
Flower power may have been the rallying cry of the US countercultural revolution.
We're lost in a beautiful energy, an energy of life, an energy of love. It's the energy that's in every living entity.
But behind the clouds of grass, psychedelic trousers and daisies, a serious revolutionary political movement flourished in opposition to US foreign policy. Successive administrations preferred, however, to focus attention on the drugs rather than the politics.
We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
Tricky Dicky declared the hippie guru Timothy Leary the most dangerous man in America. Quite the claim from the man secretly bombing Cambodia. You would think that Leary's friend Abby Hoffman would have been a bigger worry, given his plan to use psychic power to levitate the Pentagon and turn it orange. The US government eventually found cause to imprison both Hoffman and Leary. But Leary escaped in 1970 with the help of a serious left-wing terror group, the Weather Underground, who decided all this peaceful protest against the Vietnam War wasn't really getting anywhere. With a name inspired by a Bob Dylan song lyric, the Weather Underground had decided they would also levitate the Pentagon, the Capitol, and numerous other targets, not with thought waves, but with high explosives. Their revolutionary ambition, however, wasn't matched by their hand-eye coordination, and 3 members were killed while constructing bombs in a Greenwich Village brownstone. If their shift from peaceful revolution to something less flowery seems surprising, it shouldn't be. They had only followed the trajectory of most revolutionary movements. Just ask the inhabitants of Boston. On the 16th of December, 1773, around 50 American patriots dressed unconvincingly as Mohawks made an unusually large brew by dumping 90,000 pounds of British tea into the harbour. No taxation without representation was the American colonists' cry. Upset at being taxed by a British Parliament they didn't elect. At the start, it was a dispute about the violation of their rights as Englishmen. But it soon begged the question, why be British at all? And escalated into the Revolutionary War. And when Lenin arrived in Russia after his train ride through Germany, he immediately began turning a largely peaceful revolution into one of his own making. Which would be a bloodbath. So, the smug individuals unwilling to give up their positions of power, comfort, and excess have rejected your perfectly reasonable demands. You've tried slogans, peaceful protest, possibly even psychedelic trousers, but to no avail. Is it now time to man the barricades? Yes! But actually, you might want to think about womaning them.
Lenin famously said in 1918 that the success of a revolution is dependent on the extent to which women are involved in it.
Not that women are always welcome on the front line. In which case, like Petra Herrera in the Mexican Revolution, you might need to go undercover.
She would pretend to shave every morning to stave off questions as to her lack of a beard. And she rose through the ranks all the way to captain and had 200 men under her authority before revealing that she was indeed a woman.
Which went down poorly with guerrilla leader and man who would certainly benefit from a good shave, Pancho Villa.
Pancho Villa sort of deranked her and she ended up leaving. But she didn't quit, and this is the impressive thing about Petra Herrera, is she then founded her own women's brigade and recruited 400 women who did also serve as combatants in 1914 in the revolutionary cause.
Even in medieval Europe, women played a key role in revolutions, though history has done a great job of overlooking them. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 is largely believed to have been led by a mob of rebel men. But the original records show that women played a vital role and didn't mind getting their hands dirty. When the peasant mob arrived in London to take Simon Sudbury, who was both Lord Chancellor and Archbishop of Canterbury, to task over his hated poll tax, it was one Joanna Ferror who made it clear just how angry she was by ordering his head lopped off, alongside that of the Lord Treasurer. She also seems to have torched the finest palace in London and done a fair bit of relieving the nobility of their gold. The late 18th century was a hotbed of revolution. So when 16 ships of the Royal Navy downed Tours, the Admiralty were relieved to find it had less to do with liberté, égalité, fraternité, and much more to do with the fact that the Navy hadn't had a pay rise in 139 years. So, thanks to full pardons, better pay, and improved conditions, the Admiralty and King George could sleep safely in their beds. Until shortly after, when the crews of several ships anchored at the mouth of the Thames took it a little further, blockading London and demanding, amongst other things, an end to the war with revolutionary France. This time, the Admiralty caught the whiff of real revolution, especially when mutineers elected Richard Parker president of their so-called floating republic, largely on the grounds that he was one of the only below-deck crew who could read and write. But when the fleet refused to follow him to France, the admirals seized their chance. Parker did not receive a pardon, was quickly convicted of piracy and hanged from the yardarm of his own ship. So maybe you're better off enlisting the officer class to join your fight. Well, that depends.
Today, The Big Picture takes you behind the scenes of West Point, the United States Military Academy. A name that's synonymous with your country's history, your country's military achievements.
In 1826, the officers at America's West Point Military Academy mutinied over the shocking decision to make their Christmas eggnog alcohol-free. After a long night of shooting and drinking, 19 cadets wound up being court-martialed. 10 expulsions and 6 resignations among the cadets brought the affair to an end. Although amongst the eggnog mutineers were 2 future generals who later pursued a very serious rebellion. That of the Confederacy against the United States. Oh, and 1 Supreme Court justice. It's all very well having junior officers and foot soldiers on your side, but surely even better if you can count on the generals as well. In which case your revolution might be called a coup d'etat.
So when it comes to what do you need for a successful revolution, you need to control the forces of coercion. In other words, the military, the police, and the judiciary.
In 1936, from his base on the Canary Islands, General Francisco Franco kindly offered to help Spain's democratically elected left-wing government crush nationalist unrest in the army, while also hedging his bets and conspiring with nationalist generals plotting a military coup. Indeed, Franco's outwardly indecisive fence-sitting earned him the nickname Miss Canary Islands 1936 from the other military plotters.
General Franco turns to the north.
It would not be a title he would hold for long, however. In the bloody civil war that overthrew the government, one leader emerged with supreme power. Miss Canary Islands, 1936. His fellow generals wisely stopped making jokes about Franco after that, especially as Franco spent the next 30-plus years savagely repressing all those who didn't share his extremely conservative worldview. For Franco, there was no question who was going to be in charge. In Russia, while everyone had agreed it was time for the Romanovs to step down, the current state of affairs didn't suit Lenin and his Bolsheviks.
When Lenin returns to Russia, what he found was that the revolutionary parties and the workers, they had actually done the hard work of radicalizing the population, and the moment was ripe for a socialist revolution.
The Russian people were getting restless and wondering why their troops were still dying in the Great War. So the door was open.
There's a great deal of instability. The Bolsheviks begin to rise as a clear leading force. By the time we get to October, we've had several months now of instability. The Bolsheviks see that no one essentially has the reins of power, and now is their opportunity.
And that's when things got ugly. Lenin and his Bolshevik party now triggered a new, more violent revolution, helpfully called the October Revolution, to distinguish it from the February one. Although at the time, Russia was using the old Julian calendar, and in the standard Gregorian calendar that Russia adopted the following year, it actually took place in November. Which clears that up, and brings us neatly to the great challenge of any revolution, making sure you're alive and on top when it's over. But how do you keep power once you've got it? The October Revolution left Lenin and the Bolsheviks in charge in Moscow, but it triggered a massive, bloody and unpredictable civil war. There was at least one outstanding variable that Lenin could deal with. He decided it was time to get ruthless with the royals.
Nicholas is living in the countryside, and the Bolsheviks realize, as long as he remains, he will be a symbol around which the opposition can rally. So the decision is taken to finally execute the Tsar and his family.
Nobody would be able to turn back the clock now. But revolutions are fragile things, and even with the Tsar and his family dead, counter-revolutionary forces would fight on with the help of foreign powers for another 5 years before the Bolsheviks could really crack open the vodka. The problem is, with stakes this high, the people you've rebelled against are unlikely to go quietly. It had been a century of two halves for 14th century British peasants. Millions had died in the Black Death, but the subsequent labour shortages meant better pay and better conditions for the survivors. This bothered the aristocracy, who worried their peasants were getting too big for their muddy boots, so they began capping pay and enforcing ancient feudal rules. When the 14-year-old king, Richard II, announced an ill-timed poll tax, the people had had enough, and a peasants' revolt spread across the whole southeast of England, led by Wat Tyler. When Wat forced the king to promise all kinds of reforms in return for a peaceful resolution, the revolution looked like a big success. But kings don't like giving away their power. And then the Lord Mayor of London decided to short-circuit negotiations by killing Wat Tyler. The king, the mayor, and over 5,000 soldiers returned to the bargaining table with Watt's head on a stick. This rather dispirited the peasants, and everyone went back to their ploughing and bowing. Although the king did quietly shelve his poll tax. In 510 BC, an aristo called Cleisthenes thought he had the gods on side when he hatched a plot to overthrow the tyrant ruling his city of Athens. His family had paid for a shiny new temple to Apollo at Delphi, which meant Cleisthenes could lean on the resident oracle to tell the Spartans to send military support. But the Spartans can be a fickle bunch, and whilst agreeing that Athens needed a change, they decided that change wasn't Cleisthenes. Thankfully, the gods were clearly still on side, as that's when the people of Athens rose up and took control for themselves, resulting, legend has it, in the first democracy in history. But whatever happens during your revolution, just don't give up. In 1791, the people of Haiti, inspired by the French Revolution, overthrew their colonial rulers and then fought off attempts by the British and Spanish to fill the vacancy. But once Napoleon rose to power, it became clear his commitment to liberty, equality, fraternity didn't extend to the people of Haiti. In 1802, he sent a counter-revolutionary force to take the island back and reinstate slavery. The rebel leader Toussaint Louverture was captured and died in a French prison in 1803. But his revolution didn't die with him. The rebels defeated the French again, making Haiti the first independent, post-colonial black state and the first country on earth permanently to abolish slavery. Just next door, Fidel Castro's successful Cuban revolution led to over 600 assassination attempts, all of which failed. And despite the many attempts to topple him, Cuba remains one of the few Marxist-Leninist states to survive the Cold War. Many of his comrades weren't so lucky. Che Guevara, Argentinian-born alumnus of the Cuban Revolution, became the poster boy of militant Marxism as he set about sparking revolutions against capitalist oppressors all over the world.
An Argentine with a Botticelli angel's face and a scholar of Marx.
There is something called the Operational Code of Communist Movements, which prized violent revolution, cellular-type operations, scorned democracy, that makes them particularly prone to producing leaders like that.
But perhaps you don't want to get involved in too many revolutions. Inevitably, Che became a hunted man, and his ill-fated insurrection in Bolivia proved one revolution too far. Captured and executed at the age of 39, Che was destined to live on in T-shirts and posters everywhere. But it's not just your enemies that you'll need to look out for. As we heard from Ben Franklin, if we're going to succeed, then we should all hang together. But it turns out many of your revolutionary comrades might prefer you to do that bit on your own. In America, in 1779, Major General Benedict Arnold, a hero in the early stages of the revolution, turned to the British when he was overlooked for promotion, offering to betray West Point to them in return for hard cash and a commission. But Arnold proved no more loyal to his new British friends. When he was uncovered, he promptly escaped, leaving his loyalist handler behind to hang. To this day, his name is a byword for treachery in America. But what about your true comrades, those who manned the barricades with you? Surely they're reliable. Well, no. After years of fighting, famine, and purges that left as many as 12 million dead, Lenin's Bolsheviks were firmly in charge. As the great leader's own health was failing, he found himself encircled by ambitious friends, all eyeing the top job once he stepped away from the podium.
So the main players here are Trotsky, very charismatic, very popular. We also have Kamenev and Zinoviev, who are good functionaries, good ideologues in charge of the press. And then we have Bukharin.
And if you think that lot looked dodgy...
And then finally in the background, the gray blur, as he was known, is Joseph Stalin.
Which brings us on to the last stage of our plan. For a moment that by singing, marching, or mounting the barricades, we've secured power. The grateful crowds are cheering for at least as long as you continue to train your guns on them. Now things get really tricky. Will you be any better than the last bunch?
Power is the most addictive of all drugs. Most people will do anything, betray anything, in order to keep it. Once you're in power, you are surrounded by all of the things that governments do to make better the lives of their leaders. They play to and swell the ego and the narcissism of the people in charge.
The Spanish artist Goya portrayed the pitfalls in his famous engraving, "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters," which illustrates how radical political ideas can quickly get hijacked by figures like Napoleon as a motive for aggressive expansionism. The brutal invasion of his country by France's revolutionary forces proved Goya right. We'll never know quite how Lenin's own plans for Russia would have panned out, as he died from a stroke in 1924. Though his enthusiastic repression of anyone he deemed not quite revolutionary enough might give us a hint. But with Lenin dead, the starting gun was fired on one of the bitterest succession disputes in history. The race soon narrowed to two front-runners. Leon Trotsky seemed a good bet, being popular with the Red Army he'd led to a hard-won and bloody victory. But snapping at his heels was a more surprising heir apparent: Joseph Stalin.
He wasn't this kind of clear, charismatic leader. Instead, he was known as the Commissar of Paperclips, the General Secretary, and at the time that literally meant you were the person who took the notes.
But by the time of Lenin's death, his relationship with Stalin had well and truly soured. Not least because of the insults Stalin repeatedly directed at Lenin's loyal and party-supporting wife, Nadezhda.
So Stalin and Lenin's widow, Nadezhda Krupskaya, had a bit of a, shall we say, heated relationship. Nadezhda complained to her husband often about how rude and coarse Stalin was. And then, of course, we have the famous quotation that is attributed to Stalin, you know, "We can always get another woman to play Lenin's widow."
To be fair, Stalin had never liked the intelligent and resourceful Nadezhda, having once told Lenin she was a syphilitic whore, which is not something you should ever call your friend's wife. But with Lenin dead, the gloves were really off, and Stalin was about to show his true colors. When Stalin seized power, he gave his rivals a choice: support him or be purged, or sometimes both.
If anyone dares to disagree, he's given a speedy trial without benefit of jury. Such traitors may be immediately executed or sent off to prison.
With comrades like this, it might be wise to make yourself scarce before you receive the inevitable knock on the door.
So Trotsky leaves the country in the late 1920s, and he has almost a decade of roaming around Europe trying to find a permanent home. He ends up in Mexico, where he lives with Diego Rivera and his wife Frida Kahlo.
Discredited, exiled, and banished, Trotsky was ultimately introduced to an ice pit down Mexico way.
He succumbs to his wounds and he dies the next day. All of this was on Stalin's direct orders.
But let's not jump to conclusions. Perhaps away from politics, Stalin was a loving family man. Well, no. Bearing the brunt of Daddy's tough love was his eldest son, Yakov, who was captured while serving with the Soviet army in World War II.
Stalin is so disgusted with his son for being taken prisoner because he thinks he should have killed himself rather than be captured. But baby Stalin ends up killing himself. Cause of death seems to have been that he ran on purpose into an electrified fence. So it doesn't end well for him. Not so nice to his other son either, who ended up drinking himself to death. His second wife, she'd shot herself in the chest to get away from him. They said that she died of appendicitis.
Perhaps Stalin was at least a generous host. Well, no. At banquets, he would throw food at his guests and referred to his deputy, Nikita Khrushchev, as his Ukrainian bear, forcing him to dance on the table. But the main thing that can get you labeled a monster, at least by people who can't be overheard saying it, is killing your comrades and the people you started the revolution for. Trotsky was hardly alone. Stalin also liquidated hundreds of his old comrades to consolidate his power. In the wider society, his flawed policies and savage purges caused millions of deaths.
Statistics are sparse, but it's known that over 10 million were executed or died in concentration camps, including members of Stalin's own family.
Death tolls in history's revolutions are often a source of debate for historians. But here are three of history's bloodiest revolutions in reverse order. In third place, the French Revolution. We could also include the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, in which the death toll reached millions. At number 2, the Russian Revolution. While the overthrow of the Tsar was quick and cost few lives, once again, it was followed by a civil war that cost millions. Currently, it's the Guinness World Record holder as the world's costliest civil war, with perhaps 9 million dead. Remarkably, there seems to be one more revolution that was worse. In first place, we must consider the Taiping Rebellion of the 19th century. Over the course of 14 years, it's thought that at least 20 million people died, but the toll could be even higher.
Say what you like about revolutionaries who become murderous dictators, they do like a laugh. Harpo Marx, of Marx Brothers fame, was one of Stalin's favorite clowns. So much so, he invited Harpo to tour the Soviet Union in 1933. Learning of this, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover invited Harpo to spy for the US in between shows. Harpo agreed and successfully smuggled secret documents out of Russia in his socks. Another celebrity to cross paths with monstrous revolutionaries was the silent movie star Charlie Chaplin, who in 1932, on a promotional tour of the Far East, was the target of assassins from ultra-nationalist Japanese extremists, the League of Blood.
They decided that they were going to off the Prime Minister and his son. But then they found out that Charlie Chaplin was coming to Japan as part of the world tour. And they decided that if we offed him, we could basically provoke America into conflict with Japan. This is failing. Charlie Chaplin was in fact not even for English.
The little chap hopefully avoided being murdered. The Japanese Prime Minister, however, wasn't so. Enver Hoxha, the mass-murdering dictator of communist Albania, was tickled pink by the inane slapstick comedy of Britain's Norman Wisdom and turned him into an Albanian national icon. And both Adolf Hitler and the Ayatollah Khomeini loved Mickey Mouse, though neither of them believed that the antics of the animated rodent was suitable for anyone else to watch.
We have the right to see things and express ideas, each in our own way. That's why we set it up. That's what our revolution was all about.
But not all celebrities proved so popular. According to Khrushchev, Stalin didn't let his love of a good Western get in the way of plotting to murder the Duke, John Wayne.
The Los Angeles suburb Hollywood is the famous motion picture center.
So the story goes, at least according to Khrushchev, that Stalin put out a hit on John Wayne for the cause of communism. Khrushchev met with the Duke in 1958 in a private meeting and reportedly told him that he had quashed this order and the Duke could now rest easy.
But in the end, the curtain even comes down on monsters. After one final movie night with his inner circle, Stalin keeled over. When they found him on the floor, the Ukrainian dancing bear, Khrushchev, and the rest of them spent hours not calling a doctor, worried they would get the blame. But don't think that death will necessarily release you from further indignity or help your reputation. In fact, when it comes to revolutions, being dead can be as exhausting as being alive. Eva Perón, former First Lady of Argentina's dictator Juan Perón, went on an extraordinary journey thanks to changing political fortunes. At least her mortal remains did. Following Eva's death in 1952, her coffin was bounced between Argentina, Italy and Spain as her successors squabbled over her legacy for more than 20 years. She's now finally at rest in her native land. But in death, Eva left a pretty hefty carbon footprint, clocking up just shy of 14,000 air miles. But perhaps the final indignity was reserved for Napoleon. Icon for some, monster to others, he paid a posthumous and very personal price for turning revolution into dictatorship. After defeat at the Battle of Waterloo, he spent his few remaining years in exile on the tiny island of St. Helena, where he died in 1821. Many were sad, but his doctor, Francesco Antommarchi, was furious. Not only had the former emperor once accused him of being impotent, he'd also now left him out of his will. So, Antommarchi decided to take a memento during the autopsy, cutting off Napoleon's little corporal and popping it in a jar. A priest smuggled it to Corsica, and it eventually made its way to New York, where an American collector bought it and put it on display. In 1977, it was sold to a urologist who paid $3,000 for an object which has been described as looking like a piece of beef jerky or a shriveled eel. But perhaps your revolution won't end with dictatorship, counter-revolution, or your genitals in a jar. George Washington turned down a crown and was buried intact in his family vault at Mount Vernon. And last time we looked, no one in the US was plotting a return to British rule.
When you contrast, say, the way the Bolsheviks took power in Russia to the way Nehru gained power in India or George Washington in the United States, the contrast is enormous. And it's maybe instructive that Nehru became a democratic leader and George Washington became a democratic leader. They did not become Stalins or Maos because of the way in which their revolutions were radically different.
So what have we learnt? Have a stirring slogan everyone can get behind, especially the military, as they usually have all the guns. And before you risk your best furniture on the barricades, make sure you have the women on your side. Remember, you may never get to see your plans through. But dying young can make you a rock star revolutionary who never has to deliver on your promise. Which is why all the cool kids wear t-shirts of Che Guevara rather than Joe Stalin. And never, ever trust your friends or comrades. Be ready to change sides yourself when the counter-revolution comes. But most importantly, revolutions can be circular. Expect that once the dust clears, you're likely to find yourself pretty much back in the place where you began. It's also possible that this time around, it'll be you waiting for your head to drop into the basket. Don't say we didn't warn you.